Okay, so today's intro lesson on some rhythms. Usually we use Takadimi in class. So you're going to see Takadimi versus standard, and we're going to kind of explain both. So we're going to put it in the context of this little rhythm tree that you see here in front of you. And we see that first one. We see that it's a whole note, right? And it says right here 4 beats. So if we were counting that in our Takadimi, I'm going to write it kind of on our left-hand side. We're going to see it as like ta, right? And that gives us 4 sort of beats. We can also count it in our head if we're counting it standard with numbers. So I'm going to put those in this beautiful pink color. And so if I was going to count this whole note, it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I always learned to sort of connect my numbers. So make it sound like it's legato, like 1, 2, 3, 4, if it's a whole note, right? The way that we go ta, and we count that out for 4 whole beats, right? If we were looking at that. That being said, then if we look at our next tier, switch back to, actually I'll keep my red pink pen. If we're looking at half notes, those are going to be basically like 1, 2, or 1, 2. And then our next half note with a little space between it, 3, 4, right, would be like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And when we count that with what we're sort of used to with our Takadimi, we'd say like ta, ta, right? Where we feel both of those pulses going on here. And those are for our half notes, right? And then you can see their rest equivalent on the other side there. So the rest way, we would count those, we'd think that kind of in our head silently, right? And then if I'm looking at our third tier, now these are going to be our quarter notes, and those are sort of our foundation for kind of how we feel these internal pulses. And so if I'm doing my quarter notes, usually in Takadimi, we just think about that as ta, right? And it's easy to go ta, 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 ta. Count 4 tas. But what happens when you've done 8 measures of quarter notes, which happens to us sometimes, right? How do we not lose our place? And so this is where standard counting actually helps. And we would think of those as individual beats, like 1, 2, 3, 4. And each of those as a separate beat. So like the way I just spoke it, 1, 2, 3, 4. Or ta, 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 right? And sometimes counting in our head, that way if we have quarter notes for days, it helps us just not lose our place, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4. Almost how we count our measures rest, right? You're already doing this, so it's applying numbers. Here's where it gets a little bit weird. We get to these beautiful 8th notes, our lovely friends, and we'll talk about 16th notes, triplets, and things in another lesson. But to keep today's lesson kind of short, looking at these 8th notes. And 8th notes, when we think about them in our Takadimi, we usually call them like T, 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 right? And if I could do myself a favor and not write out all of those, I hope you just kind of understand what I mean, where each one of these is T, T, right? This portion, T, 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 each one of those, right? And when we have a bunch in a row, though, you have probably experienced it where it's kind of hard to remember where you are, right? So if we're going to count those in standard, we're actually going to give them their numbers still on the first beat, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. But that 8th note is going to be represented with, I always wrote a little plus, but what I would say is and. Right, so I'm putting these little pluses there because that would be the way I would write it, but in what I would say aloud is 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and, right? So if I was going from my whole note, I'd say like 1, 2, 3, 4. Then as 2 half notes, it would become 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Then as I get to these quarter notes, you hear me space 1, 2, 3, 4. And lastly, as we get to 8th notes, we go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Right, so that way it's another way of counting our rhythms when we get them, and sometimes it actually helps to use those numbers in standard counting so we don't lose where we are, especially if we change meters. If we're in 3-4 or 2-4, sometimes it helps us to not lose our place. So I know that we're used to thinking about it with Takadimi, but if you've never heard of standard before, this is another way to do that, and I'll be posting rhythm examples using both Takadimi and standard counting for you guys.